Hello, everyone. Ganita again from the 1947 Partition Archive. Today is day 13 of the 75 Days of Partition. I've got here Professor Ayesha Jalal with me today, and she is going to be discussing a number of common misconceptions that we have as a society about partition, and also some of the important lessons that we can take away as we go into the future. What lies beyond partition? What can we learn from partition to make our future better? So Professor Jalal, why don't we get started with some of the common misconceptions? What are some common misconceptions from your own?
The primary one, of course, is that this is all because of religion, and that the reason why there are divisions in Indian society is not because of inequity, economic inequalities, not because of deep structural violence that's rooted in from colonial times, but it's all because of Hindu-Muslim differences. And I don't deny that there are Hindu-Muslim differences, but as I think if you take a long view of Indian history, you'll see that Hindus and Muslims have known how to fight, but also to collaborate and cooperate. After all, the Mughal Empire, even if there were Muslim rulers, was an Indian empire run by Hindus and Muslims. So I do think that's the primary misconception. But once the partition occurred in 1947, it became more difficult to deny this fact, even though the overwhelming evidence really is that even the way partition emerged, despite the use ostensibly of religion, that it really was a regional division, a regionally based division, because the two main Muslim majority provinces got divided, Punjab and Bengal. But effectively, at the time of partition, 40 million Muslims were left, about 40 to 45 million were left high and dry in a predominantly Hindu India. So I do think that we need to look at the evidence, but I think people either don't have the time or the desire, and the way the narrative is packaged all the time. And so partition is basic, as you know, in India. It is the primary reason for the targeting of the Muslim minority, at least currently. So I think the way in which partition as a trope is deployed is continuing to have an impact. And so it's really urgent to try and step back and understand why this happened. I don't deny that partition is the foundational myth, as I think I've said before, of the two states. But I don't think that we are still prepared for political reasons to learn the real lessons.
Right. And what do you think the blockages are? What's preventing us from diving deeper, in a greater public discussion?
I think it's political. Again, certainly, Hindus and Muslims, if they have differences, they don't sort of argue about theological issues. The issue is political. It was power sharing. I think that the reason why we don't talk about it too often is that partition has been the single factor why India can't live up to the anti-colonial commitment to a truly federal setup, because that entailed power sharing arrangement. But the point is that we know that because of partition, a great deal of the anti-colonial promise of federalism was lost sight of, and instead a particular kind of constitutional setup was imposed on India, which was more unitary in substance than in form, which means that there was a perpetuation of the colonial state in its unitary manifestations, because of course the British had created a unitary state and not a federal one. So I do think that it's that denial, and it's a very political question, because if you do say that the real issue, the partition came about because of a failure of Indian federalism, then what about the federal questions that face India today? I think that there is an attempt to sort of sideline those and try to cast this as a Hindu-Muslim question, when the real issue is really of persisting inequities and a differential sharing of power between the center and the regions.
Yeah, I think that is really fascinating, because you really can see that colonial system still playing out, because that's predominantly what was adopted. There have been some changes to it, but not enough to really be like a federal.
I mean, the basis of India's constitution is still the Government of India Act of 1935, three-quarters of India's constitution. So I do think that it's important to understand why it is important. I mean, why partition is not presented for what it is. I think it's convenient at the rhetorical level to pitch this as a Hindu-Muslim problem and not a center region problem.
Right.
Take the example even of Punjab. When the Punjab problem was at its height, it was commonplace to call it, I mean, Rajiv Gandhi is famous for having said that it was a religious issue and not a provincial autonomy issue. So I
Right.
do think that those are political questions, Gunita.
Yeah, that's definitely. I think that's a really good point. But how do you, in the current environment in South Asia in general, do you think there is space to dig
Well, I
deep?
think the space is there at the social level. I think that insofar as you let the official narratives of the nation state dominate your worldview, I don't think the space is intended. I mean, it's not meant to create space. But I think there are a lot of dissatisfied people who feel that the promise of independence has not been realized. And I think for them, there is space. I certainly find the youth who are not as I think committed to the narratives that led to partition and its aftermath. They are wanting to know why it happened. But so I think that we do need to focus on that social space that may be available for people to change their minds and to ask questions. But I do think that ultimately will have to be resolved at the political level. And it seems that the two countries and whoever takes over finds it more convenient to persist with certain narratives that divide them rather than what might unite them.
Right, right. So I'd love to move into the discussion now on some lessons that we can take away from partition. What are some top lessons in your mind from your research that you feel we should take away as a society?
I think the very sort of concept of partition. I think that, I mean, I regard it as a paradigmatic partition and that was imposed on India. And I think that we need to understand that partitions may be forms of conflict management, but they become obstacles to conflict resolution. Because basically partition of India was about a power sharing arrangement. Between the Muslim League and the Congress, the Muslim League claiming to speak on behalf of the Muslim majority provinces of the Northwest and the Northeast of India, and the Congress claiming to speak on behalf of the whole of India. So I do think that to understand that this was a power sharing arrangement, rather than something metaphysical about religious differences, I think that's the primary lesson. And that we have to avoid similar sort. I mean, I think that by not learning the lessons of partition, Pakistan underwent another partition in 1971. So the issue really here is that you need to work out arrangements where you can learn to live with each other. Partitions don't solve that. India and Pakistan have simply taken their differences to another level. I mean, it was initial. I mean, before partition, it was internal to India. Now it's an international issue. So I do think, and I mean, now with nuclear power, with both countries acquiring nuclear power, it becomes a very, very dangerous problem. So I do think the first lesson is that we have to learn to live with each other. The creation of Pakistan did not solve the problem of the subcontinent as far as that is concerned. Today we hear about similar sorts of enactments of partition, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it's Kashmir, and all I can say is that they are not going to work. They will just sort of make sure that there can never be conflict resolution. So I think that's my view, that's what my research suggests, that we need to understand that human beings disagree. Democracy, I've always said, is conflict, but you need to talk. I mean, there's no such thing of not negotiating and arriving at some compromise. I think that is part of what I would say that you need, because otherwise the solutions as drastic as partition have not solved the problem. It's like dividing a room, creating a wall, but you can still hear each other. And you can still be as much of a nuisance, even though you have physically divided.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And the other thing that I've also thought about along those lines is the amount of resources that go into
Defense,
the war.
defense. I mean, we should go into education, into health, and I mean, with the neoliberal mantra, we've that the states have pulled out of even areas that like health and education where they were underperforming. So I do think that it's just, I mean, and the other thing, Gunita, is my amazement at the extent, I mean, our obsession with issues that are distracting from the real issues. I mean, the politics of the subcontinent at this stage. I'm sitting in Lahore in Pakistan, just watching absolute amazing politics, completely sort of distracting from the substantive issues. So I think that's the other result of this. So I think that partition is the cause of many of the problems today.
I agree with you from my observation.
I think that, and I think the most important one is the belief on the part of people that it was done for religious reasons, which gives it another kind of a slant, which becomes very difficult to overcome.
Right, absolutely. Yeah, thank you. That is so illuminating. I do hope that people will take those lessons and those points into consideration when trying to conceptualize our past and our current political landscape, especially those young people who are aspiring to go into politics and leadership areas. Are there other items you might want to add on these topics for us today?
The only other thing is the violence of partition, which of course has made repairing the broken connections that much more difficult. I do think that, just look at the subcontinent. I mean, barring the recent creation of a museum in Amritsar to commemorate the victims of partition, what have we done? I mean, we haven't, I mean, if anything, the two countries have immortalized the perpetrators of that violence. And I think that there is an acute need to understand why the violence took place. I mean, I, of course, did it in my book, Self and Sovereignty, based on evidence which suggested that violence was never perpetrated by communities as a whole, even if victims were often communities. For instance, it only took a handful of men with swords to massacre an entire train full of people. So what I'm trying to say is that these were bands of perpetrators, bands of individuals who perpetrated the violence, and yet their acts, their murderous acts, are justified in terms of the community, and are just so. I think the biggest, and we are condemned to continue to perpetuate them. So I do think that we need to face the reality that the violence that occurred was not perhaps always for quote unquote religious reasons, but people were targeted for their property, because they happened to be minorities, because the subcontinent had been arbitrarily divided, and people found themselves on the wrong side of the divide. So they became targets of those who happened to acquire arms and were able to take advantage of the situation, to grab women, to grab money, to grab land. So I do think that has been a major reason why we can't seem to break out of the vicious cycle. It's how we perceive of the violence.
100%, 100% agree with you, because all the people that we've interviewed who've actually been perpetrators of violence, who do regret it now, of course, because they were young boys, and
I'm amazed. I should really watch those perpetrators of violence interviews, because I haven't seen them.
Yeah, it's very brave of them to come forward and talk about it. And most of those interviews are, we allow a spectrum of permissions to the interviewees, and most of them are sealed to the public. So you'd have to be a researcher, and as a researcher, you have access.
That will be very, very illuminating. Because that's what struck me when I was doing research for my book, The Sole Spokesman. I was horrified to meet a very distinguished citizen of Lahore, elderly, who proudly told me that they went and wreaked havoc against a village where Muslims had been killed, and he was very proud of it. So I think that this is what we have to stop and change. And if we don't, the subcontinent is hurtling to greater disasters than partition.
Absolutely, absolutely. And one of the big learnings that came out for me from hearing these interviews was that they were literally driven by loot. It was an opportunity, exactly the way you said, to go after the minorities, the vulnerable, and who
Well,
really
the evidence is overwhelming that even before the two countries, I mean, the two new countries, the two governments got their act together, a lot of the property had been taken. I know from police reports that I studied in Punjab that many Hindus who were very, of course, I mean, here, of course, the Hindus were commercially in dominant, and their properties were taken, factories
yeah.
were taken. And there was no government of Pakistan or India really in place at that time. And even the forced conversions that you hear about were really an attempt to hold on to property. Uh,
Yes, you were.
so I'll say one thing for the excellent project that you're doing, that there's still stories to be heard from those quote unquote, I mean, abducted women, the disappeared women.
Yeah.
And we really need to get to those stories still.
Yeah, and you know what I'll say about that? Like when I know a bunch of our oral historians have come across this same issue is we've met those women, we've talked to them, but they're just unwilling to put it on record. They're unwilling to.
Really? Urvashi has done a pretty good job.
Yes, she has. She has.
And
but
so
she's not using a recorder, so I think that may be the crux of it, you know.
Maybe you should just do oral recording. I mean, one of the best interviews that, I mean, the one of the best that I have heard, and I don't know whether you're aware of it. If not, I'll send you the audio link. Is a BBC program that was done in 1997, 50 years.
Andrew Whitehead. That was Andrew Whitehead.
Brilliant. And I mean, it had Gujral there, who talked about a sister of his that I never knew existed and who chose to continue living in Jhelum. So, I mean, that program is really one of the best. I mean, so maybe you should think of doing audio recordings rather than.
We offer audio as well. So what's happening in, especially in the rural areas, I mean, we definitely have, I would say about like two hands full, about 10 or so interviews like that. But in a majority of cases beyond those, what happens is people are unwilling to let their, future legacy, their descendants know that they were, if they're living in India, that they were once Muslim, or if they were living in Pakistan, they were once Sikh. But in some rare cases, their descendants come forward and say, "It's okay, we give you the permission." But that's been the big issue, is that they're unwilling.
That's why films like Pinjar and films like Khamosh Pani have been so successful in conveying what I'm trying to convey. And I do think that that's the way forward. Maybe we have to do it in that form rather than in the one that you're trying to do. But I still think that that's really a fundamental problem that we need somehow to, and as my last point that I really want to say about partition is that, you need to forget certain things in order to live. And I think that, so that's the only way that we certainly need to remember partition in many respects, so why it happened, because we have to make sure that it doesn't happen again. But at the same time, we also need to forget in order to move on, i.e. to forgive and forget to move on. I think that's very important as well.
To forgive, right, absolutely. And these are all really great points, and thank you so much for bringing them up.
Thank you for having me, Gunita. All the best.
It was great to have you here today, and I look forward to continuing our discussions offline.
Good luck for this excellent initiative. All the best.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Take care. Bye.